Inspire Instructor podcast, where the learning never stops. Welcome, you wonderful people, to the Inspire Instructor Training podcast, and welcome back for season 3. So this season, I'm super excited about this season. It's all going to be all about how to, and I really wanted this podcast to be a training tool for you guys and have key takeaways that you can actually implement into your lessons. So this season is all about that. We're going to be discussing key topics all the way through. For example, today we're talking about roundabouts. We've got a podcast on motorways, dealing with anxiety, how to deal with pupils with neurodiversity, and lots of other topics, but they're all about how to. So how do we actually deal with these situations in our car? So I'm super looking forward to that as a season. So before you miss out on any of that, I would suggest you hit subscribe. So go do that now. Hit pause right now. Go hit subscribe. Have you done it? Good. So today's episode, we have Spary on from ADI and PDI Doctor, and we are talking about how to teach roundabouts. We actually end up talking a lot about how not to teach roundabouts as well, and how to prepare your pupils for roundabouts. It's a great episode with lots of key takeaways that you can go and implement into your roundabout lessons, or maybe even just consider how you're going about delivering roundabout lessons. So before we head on to the show, I just want to talk to you about our workshop that we have going, which is the We're Only Human workshop. We've had some amazing feedback from people who've already been on the show. It's a really interactive workshop with lots, again, key takeaways. We're really keen to sort of kind of make sure you have stuff that you can go and implement on your lessons. We make it interactive and practical, so you have an idea of how you're going to go and implement it on your lessons without doing role play, because I know a lot of people aren't a fan of role play. So we've got some great workshops coming up. We are in London on the 9th of July, that is South London. We're in Northampton on the 8th of July, Bristol on the 9th of September, Plymouth on the 10th of September, and Warrington on the 15th of October. And we have some deals on the website which will allow you to, if you group book, you can get some discounts. So bring a friend, or if you're a franchise or within a franchise and you can bring more than a couple people, you can get some heavy discounts on that workshop. So go head over to inspireinstructortraining.com and get booked in. But for now, we'll just head over to the show. So we have a doctor in the house today for our first episode of season 3. So welcome, Spary.
Hello, good morning, and welcome.
Thank you. And so this season we are really focusing on how-tos. So I really want the season to be about having key takeaways on how do I go and deliver this lesson. Now, I get that the instructors, so today we're going to be talking about how to teach roundabouts, and there's not an instructor out there that doesn't know how to teach roundabouts. I would say you're doing it day in, day out, but hopefully we can have a conversation and maybe they can kind of pick up on something that they've not heard before, and maybe try and implement that into their lessons, because you're out there every day teaching on your own and you don't see necessarily other people's lessons, and I think it can be nice to hear other people's ideas. So we've both obviously got a lot of experience and tried lots of things and seen what's worked, and then I think also we both sit in the back of a lot of lessons, and I know that I pick up stuff from other instructors, sort of like I might go and try that, and we have conversations around these things, so we might have some ideas for the listeners out there. So I'm going to start off with Lee. How do you teach roundabouts?
Well, I think with most things, I think it's important to try and not teach them. I think it's important to try and help the learner figure them out. And I think roundabouts are one of those things that if it's not right in your learner's head, then they end up going around in circles. That's actually quite funny, isn't it? I didn't even mean to do that. That can be my opener. Yeah, if you get them wrong, you end up going around in circles. So I think teaching them it then results in the learner having to remember everything that you've said about roundabouts, which then makes it harder for them. Roundabouts tend to be one of them things that learners fear before they even attempt one. It's just one of those things, I think, that they think about before. And of course, fear will always decimate their performance. So I think it tends to come from a lack of three things. So, and like everything, it's knowledge, understanding, and skill. If we don't have that, then we're going to fear the unknown. If we don't know what we need to do, if we don't really understand how we're supposed to be doing it, and most importantly, if we don't have the skills that we need to do it before we do it, then that creates that fear, and then that fear becomes an obstacle. And sometimes I think the mistake that we make is that we try to talk them through it. So they're thinking, well, you don't need to know all the ins and outs because I'm going to talk you through it. But if your learner's already fearful of roundabouts, then that's going to release those performance damaging chemicals into their body like testosterone and cortisol, which will then lower their ability to hear what you're saying. And I suppose the red flag with roundabouts is always when you ask them, say at the roundabout, go straight ahead, second exit. So nice, clear, concise directional instruction. And then seconds later, they're on the roundabout going, where am I going? Where do you want me to go? And that's the red flag, because that's auditory exclusion that's come from that fear, that's come from those chemicals that have flooded the body. So if they're fearful of them, then even talking them through it will result in it not working. But like I said, I think that fear comes from the unknown. Like, we don't really understand it. We don't really understand what we're doing. We don't really know where we're going, and we don't really have the skills that we need to do them. So I think it's very important that we get all that right first. And of course, that can sometimes come from our directional instruction, even at the start. So if we're using crap instructions like ahead at the roundabout, I'd like you to turn right, and I'd like you to turn left, then that's going to cause confusion. But even if we are giving good directional instructions, clear and concise, then if they're still full of fear, still full of cortisol, still full of adrenaline and testosterone, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna, with cortisol and adrenaline flooding the body, they just won't hear what you're saying. So they need to have that level of understanding first. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So I think that really comes from us. And we were sort of talking about that earlier. Like, I think we have to do our bit. We need to make sure that we've done everything we need to do.
Jump in there because I want to jump in on something you mentioned earlier, and I absolutely agree that this and probably this more so than most topics causes that level of stress for a pupil. And I think even if you get them across the roundabout, and manage to talk them across the roundabout, learning probably hasn't taken place because they're not taking it in. But the one thing you mentioned earlier, and you maybe were about to go on to this, so apologies for jumping in. But you mentioned about how, because I said, how do you teach roundabouts? And your first thing you said, well, we don't. We teach them. We get them to learn the roundabouts, and we encourage them to learn themselves. So, like old school. Actually, it wasn't even a PST on this one, which meant no one knew how to teach roundabouts when they qualified. But so the old school way of doing this would be to sit, and we're talking about them having knowledge, but would be to sit there and have a diagram of a roundabout and explain every single little part about how to do a roundabout to the learner. Which would be teaching them roundabouts. So how do you have that conversation? Because I've had this recently on a workshop where we mentioned about the fact that we wouldn't necessarily do a briefing, and they were like, "Really?" And confused about what that meant, and we had a conversation.
Good lad.
We weren't
I can't be doing with that word in 2024.
No, but we weren't too far. We actually weren't too far away. It was just our meaning of the word briefing was different. So how do you go about that? So like, you've got a pupil, brand new pupil, well, not brand new pupil, first time they're coming up to do roundabouts. This is their first roundabout lesson. How do you start that conversation with a pupil?
Well, we could, it's important to find out how they want to learn it, because it's a new thing to start with. So And I think we've now got over that idea that everyone has a learning style, haven't we?
Yeah.
Hopefully we've got over that. So we
Everyone.
don't need to find out if they're visual or if they're kinesthetic. We just need to give them options and say, so how would you like to go about this new thing? Do you want to have a chat about it first? Do you want to look at it on a diagram first? Do you want to watch me do it and then you can try it? Or do you want to just try it and I'll keep you safe based on what you know already? So we'd find out how they want to go about it, but then we need to make sure that knowledge and understanding is in place to start with, because quite often the problems that learners are having at roundabouts are the bit before the roundabout. And if that bit's not right, the roundabout ain't going to be right either. So really, I'd just start with Q&A, maybe with a diagram if that's what they wanted. And I'd be looking at what they already know in terms of that pre-existing knowledge and understanding. So, and this is often the problem with part 3, where people on part 3 decide that they're going to do roundabouts, and then they try to shoehorn that learner into that lesson. And it's pretty obvious to the examiner that that learner has key MSPSL issues, for example. So why the hell are they at roundabout? Why are they not honing their MSPSL skills somewhere else and then taking their working, independent, fully understanding, full knowledge, full skills of MSPSL and then applying it at a roundabout? And I think that's often a mistake we make during lessons. And then that leads to that kind of plate spinning scenario where you're working on roundabouts today, but you're also working on the fact they're not checking the mirrors and they can't get the speed right, and they keep stalling as well. And then you've got all these plates going on. So all these things really should be in place before we ever go anywhere near one. And that would mean that you and the learner have one plate to spin between you. Surely that makes it easier for everybody. So I would not have a briefing, but we'd start with Q&A, find out what they know, and transfer from what they already know. So if we were turning left or right, which mirrors would you need to use, and which way would you signal? So they know that from previous junctions. And then we get to sort of looking at positioning. And if we've done traffic lights before, we should have a basic understanding of using the right lane for turning right and using the left lane for everything else. And I think it's important with that we don't teach that, but we don't teach which lane to be in. And when we sort of bring that from a previous, bring that previous knowledge in. So you could say to your learner, if you were turning right into a side road, for example, where would you position the car? And they would say, well, I'd move up against the center line. It's like, okay, that's fine. And then if you draw a line down the middle of the page on that diagram of a let's say a side road on the right, then your learner can see that they're in the right-hand lane because they're next to the center line. And then you would say, well, would you always move up against the center line? And they would say, well, no, that's just for right turns, isn't it? Yeah. So where would you be if you weren't turning right? And they'll say, well, I'd be over there near the curb. Right. So which lane would that put you in then? Oh, that put me in the left lane. So if you're approaching a roundabout that's not got lane markings and it's got 2 lanes, if you're going straight ahead, which lane would you be in? It's like, oh, I'd be in the left one. Okay, and what about if you're turning right? Well, I'd be in the right one. So we already know that. We don't have to remember that now because we've figured that out for ourselves. So that's what I meant about getting to figure it out. So they now know which mirrors they need, and they know what signal to put on, and they know what lane to choose on approach. And then the next thing we'd talk about, in terms of an MSPSL routine, would be speed. But I think that's where we always get it wrong as instructors. And I always say this to PDIs, that if you're approaching a roundabout, or if you're approaching a side road on the left, or if you're approaching a traffic light to turn right, or if you're approaching a T-junction, this is a skill that the speed and the look step is a skill that we should already have way before we start looking at roundabouts. So, if we were doing that, we wouldn't slow down to a generic speed and pick a generic gear and then start looking at the junction. But that seems to be the way we teach it because MSPSL is in that order. So we end up with learners that are slowing down to generic speeds, picking generic gears. Probably the speed they're picking is the speed that their instructors told them to choose, and then picking the gear that they've been told to go into. And then we're having to look at this junction, and all of a sudden we're approaching it too fast or too slow. So, if you went out today, this afternoon, and you drove, there's no way you'd do MSPSL. You would check your mirrors, you'd signal, you'd position the car, you would look at the junction next, and if it's a tight one, you'd slow down to X speed. If it was a wide one, you'd slow down to Y speed. If it was a closed, you'd be slower than if it was open. If there was a car coming, you'd be slower than if there wasn't a car coming. And you would pick a speed based on that observation, and then you'd pick a gear that fits that speed. So really, the S and the L are the other way around.
I'd almost argue the P is sometimes in a different position as well, depending on the junction that you're approaching, because you may not adjust your positioning. Like if you're doing a left emerge, you quite often don't adjust your positioning until right at the last like section of the junction. There's an interesting, just a couple of things on what you. 100%. I'm on the same page. It's about developing this idea that they got to pick out the bones and work it out for themselves. So again, is I very much always try and drum into all the instructors is it should never be about remembering. It should be about understanding and knowing. I interestingly do it slightly different. I love that little use the right hand turn as a concept. I think I've heard you talk about that before actually, and I do love that. The way I sort of kind of go about that conversation is I have my little toy cards diagrams, and what I like for them to understand actually is the benefit of the fact that you use the left lane to go straight on. And it's the same. It's actually really interesting because it is the same benefit. The reason we position to the right to turn right on a road is so that the traffic going ahead can carry on flowing. And that's the same benefit for turning right. It means we can have two cars on the roundabout at the same time.
Again, that's something they already know, isn't it? They already know that from when they've done side roads and stuff like that. So that can be brought across to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I always start that conversation with I tend to get a diagram out. Obviously, we've had a conversation. Maybe they want a demo and stuff, but normally they want that. Like I would say, 90% of my pupils want a conversation first. So the diagram comes out, and I just say, "Tell me what you know." Like I start with that. Like, what do you know? And I think I do that with every topic I talk about. Is that it's that what do you know? Maybe if I've got kind of sort of people that likes mind maps, we might get a mind map out, and then we'll just mind map up the topic and go through that. Just going back to what you were talking about with the speed on the approach thing, and again, I think you're 100% right. I see it so often. Like slow down 10 car lengths from the junction. I don't even know what that's quite far back, isn't it, actually? But this is my point. I don't know the answer to that because I don't drive like that, and I certainly don't teach like that. If you start putting car lengths, meters, numbers on the speedo, even gears, and I hear that a lot as well. Like this is a second gear junction, this is a first gear junction. No, it isn't. It's a slow junction or a faster junction, and therefore you're matching the gear to the speed you've chosen.
Yeah.
Uh, the question I always love to use for both junctions and roundabouts, and this is the point, is the fact that you said they've done it before, is what factors are you taking into account when choosing your speed? And you listed a few there, like is it busy, is it wide, what's my visibility like? And if you've done that, like you say, with them at junctions, how are they choosing the speed on the approach to this junction?
Yeah.
When we go to roundabouts, it's just natural for them to maybe take in a few different factors, but
Yeah.
they've got this concept of there is no speed. There is no speed you do on the approach to roundabouts. It's different, and we could do the same roundabout 10 times. It's different every time, um,
Yeah.
a- and I think that's the important factor there. So yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, I mean the thing is as well is it's like I said, it's something it's a skill they've already got. That skill of observing and picking a speed that fits. So if we've done side roads on the left, that's really the first opportunity, isn't it? So we're driving along, we have to look at it in advance. Some of them are wide, some of them are tight. Some of them have parked cars around the corner, some of them have pedestrians waiting to cross. So we have to look at it in advance, and we need to build that skill of picking a speed that fits the observation. And it's never a number. When I've done this with learners, it's like I don't want you to slow down to a certain number. I want you to slow down to a speed that fits. And what fits is you've got time to observe and you've got time to do the steering accurately. So, and if you're looking down at the speedometer, you're not looking at the pedestrian waiting to cross or the parked car around the corner or whatever else. And that's on a simple junction where there's not really a give way scenario unless there's a pedestrian, waiting to cross and stuff. So we can hone that skill there. And then when you've got a learner who can do the mirrors and the signal and the position, and they can look and pick a speed and gear that fits, then we can throw in T junctions because that's all of the above plus a give way line. So it wouldn't make sense to get them to do left T-junctions if they didn't have all those skills that they learned at side roads on the left, and they could do that independently. And then right turns would throw in extra things, but it'd still be all built on that. So by the time we get to roundabouts, it's a skill that we should already have. But quite often it's not. And like you said, if we're teaching them to slow down to generic speeds, then we get mad when they do it wrong. So if they're approaching, if they get used to slowing down to 10 and going into second, which is the generic thing that I tend to see for side roads on the left, and then you come across one of those really horrible little porky tight side roads on the left, and they approach it in at 10 miles an hour and do it in second, then you're saying, whoa, 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 that's too fast. You need to be in first for this one. And the learner's going, what do you mean? You told me I need to be in the second is the magical junction gear. What do you mean? And then when we start doing, big multi-lane roundabouts that we can do in third gear and do at 25, we're then going, well, why are you slowing down? Why are you trying to go into second gear? It's like, well, that's what you taught them back then. That's what they're doing. So I think it's a case of bringing all those skills with us and identifying as an instructor that if your learner hasn't got those skills, then why the hell are you at a roundabout? Because that's just increasing risk, and it's also putting more on your learner's plate. And the moment your learner has too much on their plate is the moment that it all starts to become too much.
Can I ask
So
you the question then? Why do you think we're at the roundabout? Like, why do you think maybe instructors get there too soon?
because we're obsessed with topics. So like, and I see this all the time with, and I don't know if I've talked about this before, like this very common example that I use is a learner who is emerging from a T-junction and they're lifting the clutch nicely, like slightly above the bite while they edge out. And as soon as they start to turn the wheel, they forget about the foot. Foot comes all the way up, they come flying out and they turn. But because we're so obsessed with topics, then we're looking at that as a T-junction problem. So we need more T-junctions to fix this T-junction problem. When actually, if you're looking at it as a skill, which is the coordination of the clutch and the steering, because you've got a learner who can do clutch control and you've got a learner who can do steering, but you've just asked them to rub their belly and pat their head at the same time. They can't do it. So it's not a T-junction problem, it's a clutch and steering coordination problem. If we go and do a 3-point turn on a quiet street for the next 10 minutes and we focus on improving the skill of using the clutch and the steering at the same time, then you can take that learner back to that T-junction in 10 minutes and they will smash it because they have the skills. So sometimes we end up focusing too much on topics rather than building skills that are needed in topics. And when those skills fail, we blame the topic. But it's the skills that are to blame, And it's exactly the same with this, with roundabouts. Because if they don't have that skill to look early, and it's another very common thing you see at roundabouts, is learners stopping at the line to have a look. And that's obviously hesitant and it's a high risk because the car behind has already decided there's nothing for you to stop for. So they're not expecting you to stop. And the learner's stopping to have a look. And what they've done there is that they're in T-junction mode in their head. They're in closed junction mode where they've got used to not being able to see, get into the line, and then having a look. So if we start doing that at a roundabout, we're going to get rear-ended. So we need to have those skills that we've used for side roads on the left. And side roads on the right as well would be the same thing because we have to look ahead. We have to decide what speed we need. We need to look at that and think, are we going to pick a speed that allows us to arrive at the same time as the oncoming car and therefore have to stop? Or can we slow it down a bit more to get that oncoming car past us before we turn and then we don't need to stop? So these are all skills that are being honed before roundabouts. So if we have all these skills in the bag, and the question I always say to my PDFs is, if the learner doesn't have these skills, why the hell are we doing roundabouts?
Yeah, also you can then link this back to that they may have the skills, but then the extra cognitive sort of kind of issues with the new topic and subject that might drop their skills a little bit, and maybe what you thought they had as a skill they haven't fully got yet. And so it's about being able to sort of go, let's bring that back and go and isolate that thing. It's interesting what you're talking about isolating the skill. I explained this to a PDI the other day, in a sporting sort of kind of terms, that so our goal, say for this lesson, is roundabouts, and we're trying to improve on our roundabouts, whatever the like specific goal is. If you think of like maybe a tennis player, their goal is to win the tennis match, but they don't just always practice tennis matches. That's not how they go about it. They're not always practicing the topic of a tennis match. What they do is they isolate the skills that they can't do. So my forehand's poor. And so they go and practice their forehand. And it might be within that forehand that it's their foot position that's poor. So they isolate that and they might put the tennis racket down and just work on feet positioning. And that's what we need to do with driving. It's like we go, okay, the roundabout's poor, what's the skill that we're missing, and then you go and work on it. Maybe it's approach speed, and then so we go and have a look at approach speed. Maybe we take it away from the roundabout. Maybe we're still working, we're just focused on that within the roundabout. But maybe it turns out that the reason the approach speed's wrong is because your gear changes aren't very smooth. And that's affecting you, maybe not coordinating your brake and your clutch at the same time. So now we need to go and isolate that part of that skill as well. So it's getting down to that sort of kind of nitty gritty, the core of the issue, and not just going like it's almost forgetting that we're doing roundabouts and thinking what we're trying to do is build this block of like you're adding the building blocks. And once you've got all the building blocks in
Yeah.
place, suddenly you'll just be able to go, oh, actually, I can do roundabouts, and without even realizing in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like building on sand if you don't do that. And this
Yeah.
is, I think another pressure that happens is that we feel that we have to move the learner on. We feel like we've been doing this for too long. We've been doing basic junctions for too long. They're going to start getting itchy feet. They're going to start thinking, well, when are we going to move this on? And then we feel maybe obliged to do that. But if you're looking at that from a risk management point of view, and remember, after everything else is stripped away, that's your number one job is to manage the risk. That it would always be heightening risk if a learner was doing something that they didn't know, understand, or have the skill to do. We threw it at them. And I think it's a hangover from that old way of doing things, which is we would teach topics. So we would be learning the skills that we need during the topic that we're doing. And of course, it doesn't work. Like that T junction example, it doesn't make sense. If you think about it logically, it makes no sense to do a T junction if your learner can't coordinate the steering and the clutch together. It makes no sense. And I'll give you another example that I saw last year. I was with a PDI and her learner, and they did the same fault in rotation. I don't know if I talked about this on the last one, but I'll say it again anyway. So we were coming to a roundabout, and it was quite a busy one. And he set off quite slowly out the roundabout, and there was no car coming. But then, because he was setting off so slowly, by the time he did get out, there was a car coming, and she dual controlled him. And her feedback was, "You were too slow. You came out too slow." So then we get to the next roundabout, and he tried to set off quicker, and he stalled. And she said, "You tried to bring your clutch up too quick." And then we got to the third roundabout, and he did exactly the same thing he did on the first one. So he set off too slow, and she dual controlled him again. And I said in the back, I said, "When you're setting off, what are you doing with your feet?" And he said, "Well, I'm bringing my clutch up, and then I'm adding my gas later. That's how I've always set off." And I said, "Well, have you tried using the clutch and the gas together at the same time?" And he said, "No, I've never done that." I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, it's harder." And this is something that I see a lot where instructors don't teach that because it's harder for them to teach it. And when the learner doesn't stall when they're setting off, they're thinking, well, there's no problem then. So I'll let them do it the easier way. It's easier life for me. But when you get in them situations, you end up with this not having the skills that you need to do the thing, to do the topic. And with this guy, we ended up in a pub car park. And I said, "I really want you to work on this." And the first time he tried it to use the gas and the clutch at the same time, it was like the start of a drag race, like with the wheels spinning and the smoke coming up. It felt like that. It was horrible. But within 10 minutes, he got it. And then we went back to the roundabouts, and he was really good. But he'd never done that before. And that rubbish about how you need to talk about additional weight in the back of the car on the start of the exam, that's where that comes from. Because if you're teaching someone in a manual who has got used to you allowing them to set off wrong, let's call it, by just using the clutch and then adding gas later, then that person's probably going to stall today because the clutch isn't powerful enough to get them away without the gas, where normally it is. And then, of course, the examiner gets the blame. "Oh, I'm stalling a lot today because examiner's in the back and I'm feeling they're making me nervous." but they're not. They just ate too many mince pies at Christmas. It's not a nervous thing. It's just that they're a bit heavy, and your car can't set off without the gas today. But we've never practiced it, so we keep stalling. So that's a skill, that a very early sub skill that we need to be able to do as a learner. So, and we certainly shouldn't. Certainly shouldn't be something that gets exposed at a roundabout, because it's a skill that should be in the bag already, like all the other ones.
I think it's interesting. You were talking about how it comes back from this old style of like the topics moving on, and I think I see a lot of people want to move the lesson on from a customer value point of view. They feel like if we're doing junctions and junctions and junctions and junctions, that they're not adding value, and they're going home to their parents and saying, "Well, we did left turns again," that
Yeah.
sort of kind of thing, and you're going to get that phone call going, "Why the hell are we still doing left turns? Like, what, are you like ripping us off?" And I think for me, that my answer to that is that you're not explaining what you're doing. You're not making it clear what our goals are enough, because the pupils should be going home, not going, "We're doing left turns again." They should be going home going, "Well, I really improved my speed on the approach today. Actually, that's what we kind of nailed. And my steering was like loads better." So because if they're talking about the things that they've actually improved on,
Yeah.
you are making progress as you go through the lessons. You are doing those steps, and so you are adding value, and you're not doing the same thing. You're just using the left turns as a vehicle for your learning. And I think that's if you explain it right, and you make it clear to the people the progress they're making, then that doesn't become a problem.
Yeah. I mean, and we've hardly talked about roundabouts today.
I know,
This
because
is
and I knew this would happen.
this is the point. We're talking about the build up to it, because if we
Yeah.
don't have this knowledge, understanding, and skill, then it's a heightening of the risk, and it's the heightening of it's going to go wrong. So the justification there to those learners would, and to those instructors that are feeling like I do need to move them on, is you're going to take a lot of backward steps along this journey. And the learner that gets built up properly with the correct knowledge, understanding, and skill, they only ever move forward. So to use that example with the T junction again, they might have spent longer working on that coordination of the clutch and the steering before we get there. So they're the friend who's learning to drive with another instructor is already doing T junctions, and they're still, they've been in a car park for 3 hours working on skills, and then they've only just got out on the road. So they're friends ahead of them, and that will always hurt them. But then their friend gets stuck on T junctions because he for some reason he keeps stalling, and for some reason he keeps hitting the curb on the far side, and he can't quite get the steering right while he's doing the pedals. And then your learner does T junctions for an hour and smashes them. And then they're going to have that conversation. Oh, how did you find the T junctions there? Did you stall like me? Did you hit the curb like me? Did you struggle with the steering like me? And your learner's going to go, nah, smashed it. And he's like, what? You're ahead of me now. Like, what's your instructor's phone number? So actually, in the long term, they will always pass faster because they're not taking all these backward steps. But if you build on sand, it's going to keep collapsing and you're going to keep moving backwards. So actually, it's quicker in the long term, and that's what you need to make sure your learner buys into as well.
You mentioned that we hadn't really talked about roundabouts, despite the fact we have but haven't. Let's bring it round to something a bit more specific to roundabouts. In It's not unique to roundabouts, because like we've been talking about, nothing is unique to anything. And actually, roundabouts are interesting because I do find I like using roundabouts as that ability to really like all those skills we talked about. They become more tuned in and honed and more skillful and more experienced through roundabouts, because roundabouts have that ability to challenge them, I think, with all of those skill sets in one go. But decision making on roundabouts is a big deal for learners. I think it's one that they struggle with a lot. And judging the other traffic on the roundabout. And like I said, it's not unique to roundabouts, because you have to make that decision at junctions, you have to make that decision on dual carriageways, um, in different sort of kind of sets and situations like that. But how do you go about helping and supporting learners with their decision making? Let's say we've got their skills, they can drive into the roundabout now, we've got the members PSL nailed on, and now
Yeah.
we have to make a decision when we get there.
Yeah. I think, well, it's kind of, again, it's just about transferring what they already know. So At a roundabout, let's say we need to give way to the oncoming cars that are turning across us, so we need to be keeping our eyes on those guys, and obviously we need to give way to the right as well. So if we're good at turning left at a T junction, then we're already good at giving way to the right. So we have that one. And if we're good at turning right at traffic lights, then we're good at giving way to oncoming traffic as well. So, or turning right into side roads, because it's crossing traffic, isn't it? So really a roundabout is a combination of crossing traffic and giving way to the right like you do at a T-junction. So you would always ask yourself, if your learner can't do either of those, then they're not going to do both of them at the same time at a roundabout. So that's why before you introduce something like roundabouts, you should have like a tick list, whether it's in your head or whether it's on a syllabus like my PDIs get. And it's basically all the knowledge and all the understanding and all the skills that that person needs before we do roundabouts. And if you can't tick them off, then their needs, which is what the lesson should be based on, lies in that list somewhere. And we, like you said, we need to then go back and work on those things. And then once we've got that ticked off, we then need to then use those somewhere else, because we're never really working on roundabouts and we're never really working on T-junctions. We're basically practicing our skills in a different place. So if we can turn left at a T-junction and give way to the right, and we can turn right into a side road and give way to oncoming cars, then great. So how are we going to increase the challenge? How can we make it harder for you? How can I challenge you more to do that? Well, if we try this at a roundabout, then you'd have to give way to both the right and the head at the same time. So how about that? Is that a harder challenge? So really, rather than looking at it as topics, we're basically finding harder places to work on our skills. And then you can decrease that challenge by taking it back. If they're struggling with judging the traffic coming from the right, well, let's go back to some busy left T junctions then. So we're not having to worry about straight ahead. Or if they're struggling with the oncoming cars and where they're going, maybe we could work on turning right at traffic lights. So we're not worrying about the traffic on the right because they're sat at a red light. And then if we can do both, then can we increase that challenge? And a roundabout will be a really good place to then work on both. So again, it's this obsession with topics. If we're looking at the skills that we need to work on, where can we go now to work on those skills? If they can do that on the quiet roundabouts, can we increase the challenge on look at busier roundabouts and everything's a bit faster moving? So you're just kind of moving those skills across. And something we didn't really mention when it comes to the approach bit, because obviously we're talking now about being there and looking and deciding, is looking at MSPSL backwards, I think is kind of helpful when it comes to roundabouts. Because if you think about it backwards, you're thinking, well, you're saying to your learner, and again, this is Q&A, so it's not a briefing. It'd be, where does your clutch need to be before you start turning at the roundabout? And they're going to say, well, it needs to be up again after I've changed gear. Okay. So if we look down the road, if we look down the roundabout, you'll always see a roundabout in the distance. And the professional term that I use here is the bendy bit. So the curb is always straight and then there's a bendy bit. So when does your clutch need to be back up before you start doing the bendy bit? So I need to have my clutch up by that point. Okay, right. So if you're going to bring your clutch up by that point, when are you going to start changing gear? And if you're going to change gear at that point, when would you start slowing down? And when would you position the car? And when would you signal? So when are you going to start checking your mirrors in order to get everything done by the bendy bit? And that's just coaching them through it rather than telling them when to slow down, when to start it. And learners, well, and of course you've seen this, where learners will use your MSPSL instruction, your directional instruction, as the starter point for MSPSL. And if you get it just right, if you give them the instruction at exactly the right time, you will fool yourself into thinking that they're doing it right. Because they've started the mirrors at the right time, they've ended it at the right time, everything's great. But actually, if you take that instruction away, they've got no bloody idea what they're doing. So if you work backwards from the bendy bit and get them to think about all the things they need to do before the bendy bit, then they'll figure out when to start it.
Yeah, my favorite one's always when you tell them really early where we're going and they start the routine. And I'm like, can't even see the roundabout yet.
The same with following signs, isn't it? So they'll see a sign that's half a mile away and they'll go, right, so the sign says I'm turning left, so I'll start checking my mirrors and I'm signaling. All the cars behind are going, he must be parking up, so I'll overtake him. And they go, why are these cars overtaking me?
Yeah, sat nav's the same because obviously that gives us the instruction at a different time. and they're not triggered anymore. It's like that Pavlovian dog sort of kind of situation, isn't it? That
Yeah,
they're triggered by your instruction and starts a process. Um, yeah, no, I think that's interesting, and again, I like how you're connecting it to the decisions we've made on the right turn, on the junctions. There is an element I think of the difference with. You're absolutely right about who we're giving way to. Cars coming around the corners, cars coming from the right. The thing for me, the difference is the blockers, because we
yeah,
don't
yeah,
necessarily get blockers on junctions occasionally, but not really.
yeah,
Um, and that's where I think sometimes this concept of there's cars in that area that I don't need to stop for, and actually that will help me in that scenario. And I think that can sometimes be a concept that they struggle with working out. And I suppose the other thing that maybe is slightly different to and this is what you talk about, like making it more difficult. Now it's like, so you've got this skill, this is now the next level of that skill. The other thing I think that can be different is the cars coming towards you have options, whereas on a road
yeah,
they're
yeah,
indicating right, they're going right, whereas on a roundabout they could take that exit, or actually they could carry on round and give you that option. So I think that creates, but it is like you say, the same skill, it's just more of a conversation.
yeah. That's the knowledge and the understanding.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the example I always used to use when I used to teach in Blackburn is we used to have this really busy side road on the right, and when we were turning into this side road on the right, there was always oncoming traffic, and the traffic coming from the right could never get out. They were to come out of that road, but they weren't our problem because we were turning right into that side road. And then they changed it to a mini roundabout.
Okay.
Oh, actually, and it's that knowledge and understanding that actually a roundabout is the opposite of that. So now all of a sudden the oncoming cars have to stop for you, and the ones on the right that used to give way are now the ones that you have to give way to. So, and it's just making sure they understand that difference. And I'd do that with a diagram. I'd put a red car there and a white car there. Who have you got to give way to? You say, well, I need to give way to that guy and not that one. And then just draw a circle on it. So, right, it's a mini roundabout now. What about now? And they go, oh, that's changed it, hasn't it? So now I have to give way to that guy and not. So again, it's all about knowledge and understanding before we get there, and knowing that. And talking about blockers, that is pure forward planning, and that's a skill we should have already been developing with side roads on the left, because we were looking at the side road on the left. Is it tight? Is it wide? Is it narrow? Is it sharp? With T junctions, can we see? Can we not? Is there a car? Is there not? So we're picking our speed based on that. So when we've been doing side roads on the right, we've been one of the skills that we're looking at there is timing. So can we get there later than the car that's coming from ahead, so we don't need to stop? So we don't have to stop and go into first and find the bite and set off, because they don't want to do that. So it's much better for them if they don't do that. So can we time it so we get there later? And then so all we're doing with that, really, with that particular timing skill, is we're now changing it to getting there at the same time as that guy. And then we've got the blocker. But quite often with blockers, it's when the learner is, let's say they sat at the roundabout, they're looking where their danger's coming from. So they're looking to the right. So then they don't see that guy coming from ahead. By the time that he's blocking, then they go. And by the time they go, the blocker's gone, the guy on the right's coming out, you're on the jump controls. And we never look left because we don't have to give way to the left. So again, this is knowledge and understanding again. If we look to the left and we spot someone that's turning right, going in the road that we're sat on, then at some point that guy's going to stop for him. And that's often the first clue. If the guy on the right stops, it's either because he's seen something that you can use as a blocker from over there, or he's seen something that you can use from a blocker over there on the left. So it's about, again, it's knowledge and understanding. But if you're not spending time talking about approach speed and gear and what position we need and when we're going to signal and when we're going to check mirrors, because all that's in the bag, we can focus on that new aspect. In the same way, like if you're introducing traffic lights for the first time, we're really only talking about box junctions, filter lights. And probably actually with traffic lights would be the lane thing. Which lane do we need? But we already know that, because are we next to the curb or are we next to the center line? And that's really the first time that we're looking at that. But that's the element that we're working on today. That's the new bit built on top of all this pre-existing stuff that we already have. So actually, if your learners, learners when they have problem with blockers are just not looking at them. They're not looking for them. They're looking for traffic on the right. And when they see traffic on the right, they'll stop, and then the blocker will come, and they didn't go. So now they're hesitant. But if we're good at planning ahead and picking a speed based on what we can see, then we're not going to have that problem.
Yeah, I think a couple of solutions I 100% agree. And I quite often describe it as they're looking for problems, not solutions.
Mm.
So when they're approaching the roundabout, they're looking for all the problems that are going to mean that they have to stop rather than the reasons they get to go. Or looking for gaps, I suppose, is another way of describing it.
Yeah.
Couple of solutions I come up with, absolutely this idea of like getting that skill of the approach speed right. I actually challenge them not to stop.
Mhm.
And we'll play the game of like how many roundabouts or how far can you drive without stopping the car, which they always when I love it when you explain that to them first time because they look at you like you're absolutely insane. um and so so playing that no stopping game is fantastic. I think that's a really good way of doing it. There's a prompt I actually quite often use because I think sometimes I find that they overcomplicate that decision. Have you ever heard like a pupil try and describe like give a commentary of what's going on a roundabout? They're like, well, that blue car, that red car, and the green cars do it, and it's just like all scattered and it's all over the place. And I always think as a driver, that's not happening in my head. I'm not individually identifying what everyone is doing. I'm just taking a picture in my head of what's going on and going, yeah, that's a moment, that's a go.
Yeah.
And the prompt I actually find that works the most with really well with pupils. Is anyone driving at you right now?
Yeah.
And I ask them that question and they look at it and go, no, okay, right, off we go. Like
Yeah.
he might be in about 10 minutes because he's coming down the road or he's sat waiting for this blocker. And you don't, in that situation, you don't even need to identify them as a blocker. You just go, no one's driving the car at me. I can drive into the space, and we do that on the way in, sort of kind of like, is anyone driving at you now? Yes, but when won't they be? That sort of kind of thing. So you've got that kind of like you say, you're doing that forward planning. The other solution I love to use is we play the yes no game, which is very similar to that sort of kind of thing. I think it's very much about getting the pupil to get out of their heads when it comes to this judgment of what's going on and not overcomplicate the decision. Again, it goes back to planning. So on
Yeah.
the approach to the roundabout, we are saying yes or no, depending on when we have that opportunity to go. So it might be there's loads of cars coming around from the right, so we're saying no, no, no. And therefore we should be now slowing and slowing and slowing. I had a people who I played it with once who would say no, but were still ploughing up to the roundabout. And so we had to actually change the word. It was like no, slow, no, slow, no, slow, so
Yeah.
that she would slow down. And I think that it simplifies the, and then when it becomes a yes, off we go. It simplifies the decision, I think, a little bit, gets them. You remember you talked earlier about that anxiety and stress of the decision, and yes, skill is part of that, but sometimes they can also be stressed and still have the skills. And that for me takes the conversation out of their head, the worry, the concern, the doubt. Because if you're saying yes out loud, you're likely to go. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're saying yes in your head, your brain says yes, but your feet don't.
Yeah.
And I see that a lot.
I think sometimes that decision that we're making at the giveaway line it is often comes from again a lack of skill. Like we talked earlier about cortisol and adrenaline, that can come from fear of not really trusting themselves when it comes to going first time. And that's something I noticed massively last year when I taught my husband to drive. He was the first person that I'd ever taught to drive in an automatic, and it was amazing how good he was at this making decisions at roundabouts after a very, very short period of training. And I thought, whoa, how is he this good at this? And then I realized what it was. He knows that when he presses that gas, he's gone, gone. So he's not sat there going, oh, well, I can't really take that chance because I might stall, and if I stall, then them cars are going to catch me. And it's that anxiety. But if we're good at getting away quickly, like in that example we used earlier, the gas and the clutch together, and we're comfortable with doing that as a skill, then they should be making the same decisions like people in an automatic do, which is just go because they're confident they can do that. And again, it comes back to our responsibility that if your learner is lacking confidence in doing that, then why are they around about trying to do it? Why are we not doing that at the side of the road just as a practice and building them up from those other quieter junctions? And something you said a minute ago, which kind of when you were talking about playing games, I think one game that really, really helps when it comes to looking earlier and planning earlier and looking for blockers earlier and deciding if we can go or not earlier is the one gear game. So if you say to them, right, you're only allowed to change gear once. So they have to look, and they've already decided very early that they're going to stop. So that gear is going to be first. Or they've looked really early and they've decided that we can use that guy as a blocker. If we slow down enough to get there at the same time as him, then we'll pop it in second and off we go. And I think that really drives that ability to look earlier and think earlier and make early decisions because they can only change gear once. I think that really, really helps.
Yeah, no, I like that. I never really use that because I do teach also.
Yeah.
So, it's never been a problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting you were saying about auto, and I still had that issue with pupils not going auto with auto,
Yeah.
even though they knew they could. So you're right that in a manual, I do think quite often that is the case that they don't feel they have
Yeah.
the skill to move off at the speed. And again, it goes back to go back and isolate that skill. Um, but I think there is a moment where sometimes, and maybe it's the nature of automatic pupils tend to have a bit more anxiety, nerves,
Yeah. Yeah.
lack,
Yeah.
lacking confidence quite often, and so and it's really interesting because you see the moment that their brain makes the decision, the foot twitches, and then it just doesn't follow through, I'm constantly basically my prompt quite often is like tell your feet basically like, tell your feet like because your feet aren't agreeing with your mind at the moment. And we even play a game where well, not a game, it's like a scale almost, where I would get them to scale the difference between the decision in their mind and the decision with their feet, and like what's the time difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually by doing that and just kind of getting them to scale like 1 to 5, like how quick was that, almost like their nerves, like I get them to imagine that the brain makes a decision and then it's got to travel down your body to your feet to go, and scale that sort of kind of speed thing. And just by getting them aware of that there's a difference going on there.
Yeah.
And it isn't their feet like not doing it is also their brain stopping them, but by making them think of it in that terms, it actually quickly fixes it because they become conscious of the fact that, oh, my brain's made a decision, I need to go.
I think it's confidence as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's worrying about doing it wrong, and again that comes all the way back to kind of the environment in which they're learning in. And quite often people come to lessons and they've been through our education system, so fear has always been the weapon to hit them with. So, if you don't pass your GCSEs, you won't get into college. Don't get into college, you won't get into university. Don't get into university, you won't get a good job. Then you'll have a rubbish life. And this is the fear. This is why the suicide rate is so high amongst 15, 16-year-olds, because of all that pressure, all that fear. So that translates, now they're sat at the roundabout with you thinking, oh, I'm a failure if I get this wrong. So, if they recognize the fact that they're in a dual control car where nothing can go wrong, let's make that decision wrong. Let's have Phil use the dual controls if we need to, and let's learn that was what it looked like when we shouldn't have gone. Because if we know what it looks like when we shouldn't go, we can learn how it should look when we do go. Same with braking as well. And this is nothing to do with roundabouts, but if we're teaching learners how to brake by telling them and then going off our head when they brake too hard, then right from that first lesson, they're learning that you get angry when they do it wrong. But if you just said to them, right, I want you to brake, and you give them no instructions at all, and they nearly go through the window, and you say, well, how did you find that? Why do you think we brake so hard? And what's the risk of that? And what could you do differently if you did that again? And they go, oh, maybe I'll do it a bit softer. And then we try it again and it's too soft. And we don't really stop. And then we talk about that. And within 4 or 5 goes, they can progressively brake. And you haven't taught them that. They've figured it out for themselves. So, fast forward to a roundabout, it's the same. Let's make sure we know in theory what it looks like when we can go and what it looks like when we can't go. And let's make some decisions that sometimes won't be the right one in this safe environment where I can't fail if I do it wrong, and I can't get shouted at if I do it wrong, and I can't crash if I do it wrong. And let's hone our ability to decide whether it's safe or not by doing it wrong. It's fine. And that doesn't need to get down to a dual control level. That can be you saying to your learner, I want you to tell me when you're going to go. And they say, okay, I'm going to go now. And you go, oh, hang on. So because you knew when they were going to go, you could intervene verbally. Do you know what I mean? But if your learner is learning what I can't go looks like, then they're also going to learn what I can looks like through that process of elimination. And I think sometimes when they're sat there, they're thinking so hard about, I've got to get this right. I've got to get this right. I can't do it wrong. And then they hesitate. But actually, let's get it wrong. Let's get it wrong. Let's learn from it. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. And let's find a safer way for moving forward, which of course relates back to how we learned to walk. We stood up, we fell over, we thought about it. It didn't really work. We tried it again. We fell over again. We figured it out and we learned how to walk. In the comfort of their parents' soft carpeted living room where we could do it wrong and there was no problem. So it's sometimes you have to overcome that. And I think learners sometimes feel that, they're going to be judged if they get it wrong, so they don't go. And if you have that environment where they always feel that actually if it's wrong, I can learn something, then they're
like you said, actually, by the time you've got to roundabouts,
yeah,
that should be in place already anyway, a bit like the skills sort of kind of thing, because you
yeah,
will have got, hopefully you will have got there by non-judgmental manners in the first place. So hopefully they've already they're in that environment already. A couple of ways I explain that to my pupils, and I probably explain this one more so when it comes to roundabouts, actually, because it does feel like taking a leap of faith into the roundabout. And I explain like it's a bit like a tightrope walker. And if the first time you were doing tightrope walking, you didn't have a safety net or a harness or something, it would be absolutely terrifying to take that first step onto the tightrope. And I explained that I am the safety net, so you can walk on there, you can fall off, I will catch you.
yeah,
And so that's my kind of like I become that safety net to them. The other thing, in talking about your sort of kind of like experimental learning and being okay to fail, I quite often explain it to them that I want them to pretend we're scientists, and we're exploring this concept of driving for the first time. We're the guys, like we're the ones like kind of breaking ground with learning how to drive. And of course we're going to get stuff wrong, because that's what scientists do. And then they discover why it was wrong, and then they go and do something different, and it'd be weird. In fact, if a scientist went and did an experiment and it all went very well, they would be really probably quite concerned and
yeah,
start
yeah,
looking for they'd start looking for, like, wait a minute, why is, like, what could go wrong? So I think if we explain it into that sort of kind of point where when you do an experiment, in a way you want it to go wrong so you can learn from it and then improve it, and then tweak and then do another experiment. And I think if you explain it to learners in that context, that they get it, and they sort of kind of feel like, yeah, actually we can go and experiment on this learning process.
yeah. It's just that kind of environment that they're living in, isn't it? That's what you need to create long before you get anywhere near a roundabout. Is that idea that actually it's wrong is good because we can learn from it, and then it's not wrong is like the end of the world. And I think sometimes with if you get academics and stuff, academic learners, they go to grammar school, they're captain of the football team, they're not used to doing things wrong, and the way that they've been brought up is wrong is really bad. You need to strive for excellence. So they're the ones that often beat themselves up more, I find. Like they just sort of, when they can't grasp this idea that they're not very good at something for the first time in their life, and actually it's just part of a cycle, it's part of a process. You'll get good at it when you practice it more, but it's not the end of the world. Daddy's not going to look disappointed if you do it wrong. Maybe that's different to how you've outside this car. But I think that's just a mentality, isn't it? And it needs to come from us right from the beginning. That tightrope example is great because that sets the scene right from the beginning. And when they know that it's a safe and it's a non-judgmental environment, then we can make mistakes and we can learn from them.
Yeah. So let's bring it right back round to roundabouts.
Yeah.
The whole round thing again. I love it. So it doesn't work when you mention it. So are there any myths on roundabouts that you might want to, like, so there may be instructors out there and you might want to dispel any sort of kind of myths or anything like that?
I'd say, we were talking about the 12 o'clock thing, weren't we, before we
Yeah.
started? I think sometimes, and this is not just when there's, it's a complicated roundabout, but it's really important that the learner knows where they are going and they know where they can find that information. So when you start looking at the bigger roundabouts, the multi-lane ones, the amount of times we're maybe following a sat nav or we're following a destination, and the learner isn't really thinking about those numbers that are written on the lanes. So on the sat nav, if you're following the sat nav or if you're following a sign, it's going to tell you the number of the road that you're going onto. So which lane does that say that it is? And it's that level of forward planning and stuff. The panic comes from when they don't know where they're going. And the sudden lane changes where you have to grab the wheel come from because they don't know where they go and they haven't mapped it out in their head. And obviously that kind of mapping comes from earlier subjects. Like if we're turning right at a traffic light and we're sat at a red light, are we looking to the road on the right? Because we should be looking if there's a new speed limit because it's a different road. But also, where's the traffic island and which way does the arrow point? And where are you going to end up when we've done this turn? And it's the same for roundabouts as well. We need to be thinking about where we're going. And I think something that catches people out often is they don't really know what the road is that they're on. Yeah. So if the road that you're on is the A59 and the road that you're going onto is the A59, then you're going straight on because you're not going left or right. Because if you're going left or right, you'd be on a different street. You'd be on the A59 if you went left, and you'd probably be on the A59 if you went right as well, because it's the same street. If we took the roundabout off, where's the road? It's the same street we were on before. We've just gone all the way around the houses to get back onto the same street we were on before. So if your road's the A59 and that road's the A59, then you're going straight on and you don't need to signal on approach. And the other thing is learners often struggle with, do I signal? Do I need to signal on approach? And again, you can simply relate that to what they've done before. Which way do you signal when you're going straight ahead at a traffic light? Oh, well, I don't. Well, there you go. Oh, yeah. So I think making sure they understand how to plan ahead of where they are going. And obviously it's going to start simply by you giving directional instructions at an early stage. So at the roundabout, go straight ahead. So that means we're not coming off this road. It means we're staying on the same street. Yeah. And then in terms of the lane, if there's a marking with arrow that points ahead, then that means you're going ahead. So which lane do you need to use to go ahead? If there's no arrows, then that defaults to, do you need to position yourself next to the center line because you're turning right, or do you need to stay with the curb because you're not turning right? And that's really just all part of that understanding before we do it. But I do see that skipped quite a lot, and I think the hangover from the old way of doing things is that if we tell them what to do, they'll do it right. So they don't really need to know what they need to know. They don't really need to understand it because I'm going to talk you through it. I'm going to tell you. But that is effectively your learner becomes a puppet and you're the puppeteer and you're pulling all the strings and it looks like it worked. But really it's just mindless string pulling.
Yeah, I think the example I like from that sort of kind of idea of you get told is like every area has probably got a roundabout where like even driving instructors might have a little bit of a debate about, do I signal, do I not? Or do I use the right lane? Do I not use to use the left lane? First of all, I think the issue with the 12 o'clock rule and with signals as well for the same reason is we try and put like a hard and fast rule on it. And that's not how it works. It's not how it
No.
works as drivers. You look at the scenario and you think, how best can I navigate this roundabout? How can I, like, if you think about positioning and signals, they're basically ways to tell people where you're going.
Yeah.
And they, and so how can I best tell those cars coming towards me where I'm going on the roundabout? And that's the conversation I have with my learners is well, if they ask me that question, I say, well, imagine if you're on the other side of the roundabout, what would you want from them? Like
Yeah.
if they signaled, where would you think they were going? And if they didn't signal, where do you think they would be going? And then we'll go do that, like, because
Yeah.
that's what you're doing. You're telling them, and if you talk to them in those sort of kind of concepts, what happens is they obviously work out the roundabout that's confusing and strange in your area, but they also have the skills then to go and do that in
Yeah.
whatever area they go to when they pass their driving test. And that's the important thing is they need the skills to be able to work it out, not try and remember every single weird roundabout in your area.
Well, that's the difference, isn't it? Because what you're doing there is you're getting them to think,
Yeah.
and that's what we should be creating. We should be creating these thinkers, not these little robots that follow commands. Um, the example that I always use with signaling is I was with a PDI and she shouted, she stopped the learner from moving off at the side of the road because he didn't signal. And she said, you need to signal when you're moving off. So she's teaching that little robot. And I said to her, I don't like showing my PDIs up in front of the learners. But I said to the learner, why did you not signal? And he said, well, I looked all around and there were nobody there. And I thought, you're doing this better than her. You're being a thinker. So when you're at a roundabout, you're going to be thinking, well, if I don't signal here, that car won't stop for me because he'll think I'm going straight on. So if I'm turning right, it's in my best interest to let that guy know that he needs to stop for me because I'm coming around the roundabout. If I'm coming off a roundabout, I need to signal because them guys might stop for me because they might not know where I'm going. So I'm going to put that on to say, so these are thinkers. This is what we're trying to create, this generation of thinking drivers to replace our generation of little robot people that do what their instructor said. And I still get that with part 2 PDIs. They'll say silly things or they'll do silly things like they'll signal when they're moving off when there's no one around. I don't know. I was on a podcast the other day. Or I was listening to a podcast. I can't remember who it said it, but they were talking about that, and they said, if there was nobody in your house when you got home from work, would you open every door and shout hello?
I love that. Yeah.
And I thought, well, there you go. That's exactly the point. There's nobody to signal to. Why are you putting it on?
Imagine how freaked out you'd be if someone shouted hello back.
Well, there you go. But it's about creating these thinkers, isn't it? And they're all planning on approach. They're looking at the speed. They're thinking, if I get there at the same time as that guy, he's a blocker. We're thinking, but the longer we try to just tell the learner what to do, then they'll do it, but there's no thinking. They're just being the puppet. And it always takes them so much longer to figure it out for themselves, which they'll do anyway, by the way. But, and that's why, our worst kept secret are, how the pass rate didn't really go down when we stopped doing our job and mum and dad took over. They're like, they don't have all our skills and all our knowledge, but they're just letting them get on with it and figuring it out for themselves. And that's what they will always do because they're smart. The human beings are clever. But in our industry, we tend to just, I've got to fill the head with all my amazing roundabout knowledge, which they'll only remember a little bit of it anyway.
Yeah. It's interesting that note on parents, because I think what parents do really well is get out of the way unintentionally.
Yeah.
But the beauty of them getting out of the way means the learner becomes more independent, they think for themselves, they analyze stuff more, because the parents doesn't necessarily know the answer, so they have to work it out. They may be working out together, but they have to work it out rather than being told. And yes, there are obviously disadvantages with safety and sometimes incorrect information, but they really do a good job of getting out of the way. And if we could kind of put our safety in there plus our knowledge and ability of like road and road safety knowledge, as well as being able to get out of the way and just let not just let learning happen, but to facilitate learning and be part of that encourage that process, not force that process, then yeah, we're onto a winner.
You're quite right that like the learner will always make more mistakes when they're out with the mum and dad because they're not being told how to do it right.
Yeah.
But that's why they'll learn faster. They'll learn faster because they're making mistakes. And a lot of people, like when they fail part 3, is they and I was guilty of this the first time I did my standards check. I tried to make sure that I said something to make sure that learner didn't do anything wrong. And almost this was a lady she was done maybe 30 hours of lessons. And every time because she stalled once last lesson, on this lesson that was my standards check, every single time we got to something, whether it was a traffic light that was on red or a junction or queuing traffic ahead, I said clutch down because I didn't want it to stall. And the examiner pulled me to one side and said, if you'd have not said press the clutch, would she have stalled every single time? I'm like, no. So it was an over instruction then. I was like, I'm just trying to make it not go wrong. It's like, well, how is she going to learn then? You know what I mean? And people do that on part 3. They're thinking, I've got to be super instructor. I've got to make sure nothing goes wrong. But actually, you're not allowing your learner to learn. And obviously, you've got to stop safety critical incidents. Of course you do. Ideally verbally rather than physically. But if if they're going to stall or if they're going to miss a mirror, let them do it and then have a conversation about it and then let them discover what the risk could be of that and what they could do differently and then put a little plan together to work on it. Let's let them learn from the mistakes.
Stall is quite interesting. I sometimes make them stall because I want them to experience it and experience the difference. So anyway, I had this on a lesson yesterday actually. The the pupil stalled in third gear, and I wanted them to understand the feeling, the difference of when you find that biting point and you go, oh wait a minute, that's not right, because otherwise you just keep stalling in third gear because you don't notice you're not in the right gear. And
Yeah,
so I got them to stall in first gear and then stall in third gear and then stall in first gear, and feel the difference so that they got that if they do get into that scenario where they, because that happens, like experienced drivers do that, they stall in third gear by accident, forget the gear.
yeah,
And or actually as experience improves, what often happens is you find the bite and go, oh, that doesn't feel right. Clutch down first gear, and
yeah,
you recognize it. But you can't do that unless you've allowed them that experience of recognizing that. So I was basically, and this is, I think, probably the difference between a learner and what an instructor should be doing and a parent is I recognize that moment, let them still have the experience, but sped up the experience. And that's
yeah,
what instructors should be doing, is speeding up their experience. That's what we get paid for, to speed up that process.
yeah,
But it's still their experience. So
yeah.
I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I think unless you have anything else to add for roundabouts.
I suppose in brief, make sure they have the knowledge, the understanding, and skill that they need to do it. Make sure you play your part in making sure they know where they're going before they get there. And if they can't do all the things, if they can't do all the skills that they need on a roundabout, then reassess what that person's needs are and work on those, improve them, and then try the roundabout later.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think what we've learned today is don't teach roundabouts. To teach roundabouts, don't teach roundabouts. But we spent most of the conversation not talking about how to teach roundabouts, and you're absolutely right. It's that's the whole point. And I'll be intrigued as I go through this series whether that keeps cropping up when we come to like some of the conversations we're going to have on like our anxiety and stuff like that. So that'll be different. But when we talk about rural roads and when we talk about motorways, I'm hoping it does keep coming back to actually its skills within the topic. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on. Do you want to just tell everyone where they can find you and to get some more knowledge about how not to teach roundabouts?
Yeah, you can find me at leespary.com or pdidoctor.co.uk or adidoctor.co.uk and on social media. Yeah, that's about it. Or you could send a pigeon my way if you want. But social media.
I would love it if someone sent you a pigeon. I don't know how that would work, but I would love it. So brilliant. Thank you very much for coming on and spending your Saturday morning. I'm going to leave you to go and enjoy the rest of the Euros.
I'm looking forward to if they're all like yesterday's game, the Scotland game, then they'll all be really good because that was a really good start, really good game to start with.
Yeah, I'm just looking forward to all your Facebook posts and during the games. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil.
Inspire Instructor podcast, where the learning never stops.